Hello, everyone. Welcome back. So, last week I basically only posted one lecture and it was super huge. And this week you all have an exam to do. So, I'm going to try to keep this and the lecture on relativism kind of tight, shorter in length, not burden you down with too much information. You'll have to engage with the reading material on both those things a little bit to answer a couple of the exam questions anyway. So let's just dive right into Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from Birmingham jail. This is definitely the most famous piece that we are reading in the context of this course. You could read this in so many different classes: a philosophy class, a course on civil disobedience or the nature of the law, class in American history, classes that have to do with race relations in the United States. It's also super relevant given what's going on in the country right now, where you have all of these protests and all of these acts of civil disobedience, some nonviolent and some, unfortunately, pretty violent. So, King's letter, super famous. What's the context? Well, basically, King wrote this letter from a jail cell in Birmingham, Alabama. He was arrested for participating in protests that were going on there during the civil rights movement. The acts of protest that he and the other people were engaging in were, sitting down in areas that were marked as whites only, doing kneel-ins in similar areas, like in churches, for example. Kneel-ins were really common, and organizing a march in the city. And King, along with a lot of other protesters, was apprehended and arrested. So he was writing this letter and he wrote it in the margins of newspaper in a jail cell. Go there. The letter itself is a very interesting work because it is a response to his critics. So after it was found out that King was arrested, some people, even those who were sympathetic to his overall cause and opposed to segregation statutes, came out publicly criticizing him. And he essentially wrote this letter to try to explain what he did and why, and also to respond to some of the specific criticisms that he received. So the first thing that he was criticized for was kind of just being in Birmingham, Alabama in the first place. Like, what were you doing there? Why were you even there and involved in this in the first place? And he essentially gives two reasons. First, he says, well, I had organizational ties to the Southern Christian Leadership Conference that's going on there. But his real reason is, more basically, I am in Birmingham because injustice is present in the city. And one of his famous quotes from this letter, which I've got reprinted on the slide here: "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly." King's trying to point out in numerous places in this letter, including this quote, that if you ignore injustice that's taking place in the world around you, eventually it will come back to you in some way or another, unless you happen to be, fortunate enough to not be in any marginalized groups whatsoever. We don't have the luxury of just standing by and being bystanders when we witness injustice. We have to take action to expunge it wherever we see it. Otherwise, if we're taking Birmingham, Alabama as an example, if he didn't do anything about what was going on in Birmingham, then he worries, well, that could just show up in another city in the United States, and then another city, and another city, and eventually it's going to be everywhere. So when we see injustice that's this pronounced, we have to take a stand against it. Now, King was a big advocate of nonviolent civil disobedience. So he thought that in order to engage in protests of the sorts they were doing, you needed to engage in 4 different steps to have a successful nonviolent protest or campaign. First, you've got to collect facts to determine that there are, in fact, serious injustices taking place, such that it justifies some kind of protesting action. Now, once you've done that, before you actually protest, you negotiate with the people in power, and you try to figure out whether or not a peaceful resolution can be reached without having to go through any actual protest. Assuming that negotiation fails, you then go to what he calls self-purification, which is sort of a psychological stealing of a sort. You're essentially trying to make sure that when you are detained, arrested, confronted by people in the streets, whatever may happen, you will not retaliate in any way to what happens to you. In other words, you have to maintain your decorum and your sort of pacifist-like stance. Got to refrain from using violence in whatever way possible. Self-purification was kind of like a psychological preparation for that. And then the last step is the actual protesting, right? What King called direct action. This is where you actually take to the streets and you actually march and you actually sit in the segregated spaces and so on. Now, as far as the first piece of things go, it was extremely obvious that injustice was going on in Birmingham. You had all kinds of stuff ranging from a lot of it had to do with the way that police were enforcing the laws. When crimes were committed by white people against black people, police often didn't investigate very thoroughly or did extremely, or in some cases just ignored it outright. When threats were made against the lives of black people, they were not taken seriously. When you flip these things around, when you have crimes committed against white people by black people, the people were apprehended immediately and often suffered very severe sentences. If you know much about the history of the death penalty in the South, you'll know that the death penalty in some states, including Georgia, Georgia's not Alabama, but it's the same region. Georgia famously did not use the death penalty on anyone who wasn't black for a really, really long time, and that's one of the main reasons why it was eventually struck down, as the courts essentially, when it was under review once, said it had basically become such a racist instrument of supposedly of justice that it no longer served its original function. And so you don't have the death penalty in Georgia anymore because of that. In other neighboring states in the South, you got a lot of similar practices. Bottom line, there wasn't really a lot they had to do to confirm that there was a lot of injustice in Birmingham, Alabama. It was also a region where just the outright dislike of black people in that particular city was incredibly pronounced among the general public. Negotiations with the mayor and the other people in power in the city was not successful. So King and his fellow protesters, shortly after an election of a new mayor, took direct action to try to put political pressure on the new administration to make some kind of a change. Now, the big criticism, the central one that is of interest to us for our class and for the study of ethics, is how did King justify breaking certain laws but advocating that we obey other laws? How did he make a distinction between what laws are permissible to disobey and which laws are impermissible to disobey? Which law, in other words, what is your separation between good laws and bad laws? And King's overall view is essentially that we have a moral and legal responsibility to obey what he calls just laws, but we have a moral responsibility to disobey unjust laws. And echoing the words of St. Thomas Aquinas, famous Christian philosopher, he says an unjust law is no law at all. In one particular quote in the essay, he says, an unjust law is a code that is out of harmony with the moral law. He also, at one point, singles out segregation statutes specifically as being an example of unjust laws because he says segregation distorts the soul and damages personality. It gives the segregator a false sense of superiority and the segregated a false sense of inferiority. He thought that any law that damaged human personality was an example of an unjust law, and segregation statutes were just one type of that, but obviously the one that he was most concerned with when he was writing the letter. So King's basic position, if you're thinking about the broad relationship between law and morality, is this. If you have a law that is consistent with whatever the correct moral code is, then that law is just and ought to be obeyed. But if you have a law that is inconsistent with basic morality, then that law is unjust, and you have a moral duty to disobey it. Now, there might be situations where the penalty for disobeying the law is so severe, and maybe you're in some kind of really authoritarian regime where you could not possibly escape punishment. In that kind of situation, you might not have an obligation to disobey the law. But the general obligation would be don't perpetuate unjust laws on King's view. If you can resist, you ought to resist. He also points out a couple of other relevant points. One, African Americans had no say in the passing of segregation statutes. So these are laws that are disadvantaging them, but they are not laws that African Americans actually voted for or played a role in passing. And he also mentions that he's not advocating that you essentially try to break the law and get away with it. He's a pretty big advocate of breaking the law in a public way, and in a way in which you accept the criminal penalty associated with breaking the law. The whole point of this nonviolent civil disobedience is to draw attention to the injustice that's going on in the world around you and to try to kind of raise the moral conscientiousness of other people. Now, here's another well-known quote from this essay. "I submit that an individual who breaks a law that conscience tells him is unjust, and who willingly accepts the penalty of imprisonment in order to arouse the conscience of the community over its injustice, is in reality expressing the highest respect for the law." And that might seem kind of like an odd thing to say, like how is breaking a law expressing the highest respect for it? But remember, King thinks you only have an obligation to obey laws that are consistent with the moral code. So if you see a law that's not consistent with the moral code, you should want the law to be corrected. You should want the law to be brought into better alignment with the moral code. One way that you do that is by trying to draw attention to the injustice in that particular law and get people to then want to change it. So his point here is, if you really care about the law properly understood, like the law that is consistent with morality, then you should want the law changed. And if you want the law changed, then sometimes that's going to require you to accept penalties for breaking unjust laws to draw attention to the injustice that's taking place. Now, there's one more important argument for our purposes. There are, by the way, tons of arguments in this essay that I'm not explicitly covering. He has a lot of responses to his critics that are tucked away in the fine print. I'm just kind of drawing on the highlights here that are, most important for our class. So here's another important argument for our purposes that's worth thinking about. One of the things that happened in the aftermath of the Birmingham, Alabama protests is that police were widely praised for acting quickly, effectively, and non-violently in how they dealt with the protesters. King thought this was a mistake. He thought it was a mistake to praise the police in this interest, because he thought that even though the police were acting non-violently, they could still be criticized because they were playing a role in enforcing and perpetuating segregation statutes. So here's what he says. "Over the past few years, I have consistently preached that nonviolence demands that the means we use be as pure as the ends we seek. I have tried to make clear that it is wrong to use immoral means to attain moral ends. But now I must affirm that it is just as wrong, or perhaps even more so, to use moral means to preserve immoral ends." Now, the language he's using here, the language of means and ends, may be familiar to some of you. You may be familiar with the adage, like, the ends justify the means, or sometimes phrased as a question, if a person's skeptical, do the ends justify the means? That is an encapsulation of a classic debate between deontology and consequentialism. The ends refer to outcomes, right, or goals or aims, and the means refer to the specific actions that are being performed. So in this case, when King says it's wrong to use immoral means to attain moral ends, there are all kinds of people in the course of human history who have tried to achieve morally, good ends, but used just despicable means to try to do so. And a lot of times people think, even though it would be good, to say end world hunger, it would not be good to do that by, infecting all of the people in the third world with a highly contagious and infectious disease so that they all die off. Yes, no one would be starving anymore, and that would in those areas, and that would be good. But the means that you use to achieve that would be extremely bad and horribly heinous and seemingly unjustifiable. So, a lot of people think there are certain kinds of means you can use to try to attain good ends that are clearly wrong. Here, though, King's flipping that around, and he's saying you can also have situations where you're using moral means to perpetuate an immoral endgame of a sort. So here's here are the four possible relationships you could have between means and ends, right? You could have a moral means to a moral end, a moral means to an immoral end, an immoral means to a moral end, or an immoral means to an immoral end. Everybody who thinks there are any moral truths at all agrees that case one, moral means to a moral end, those actions are morally permissible and often morally good, right? So the person who donates to charity in order to try to make other people's lives better. So you have a moral means donating to charity, and your overall end game goal is to kind of make the world a better place. That's a no-brainer. That's obviously a morally permissible thing to do, and in many ways a morally praiseworthy thing to do. On the other end, everybody also agrees that using an immoral means to an immoral end, so committing mass murder for your own personal gain, or murdering your relatives so you can get their inheritance. The end game is a completely self-interested motivation, and the means of achieving that self-interested motivation is horribly heinous and unethical. So that's just wrong. There's no discussion there to be had. That's just obviously wrong. Everybody agrees about 1 and 4. Where the disagreements in ethics typically come is on cases 2 and 3. Some people think that there are situations where using a moral means to an immoral end can be justifiable. And some people think that using immoral means to moral ends, especially for case 3, this would especially be true of consequentialists, right? Since they mainly only care about the end game outcomes, so to speak, since it all boils down to the consequences in the end. They'll generally be in favor of 3. What King is essentially saying, though, is that he is against 2 and 3. The only kind of action that King thinks is permissible, if we're holding him to his word in this letter, is when you take a moral means to achieve a moral end. That he thinks that both cases of types 2 and 3 are both going to be wrong. And that's a very extreme view, to say that there are no exceptions and that there are no cases where the ends justify the means, or where using moral means, say in your professional role or something like that, even if you're servicing a somewhat unjust end game, to say there are no such cases where those actions are permissible is a very strong view. But that is what he claims to hold, and if you look at how he conducted his protests and what his outlook was on that, it seems like he did practice what he preached in that one domain. So here are a few general takeaways from King's letter from Birmingham jail, thinking about big picture for our course. One thing, nobody holds that all laws require our obedience. So pretty much everybody is in agreement with King on this. There is a category of law. He calls it unjust laws. We could call them immoral laws, or just something else, whatever we wanted. However you want to categorize it, there is a group of laws that, strictly speaking, do not really require our obedience if the laws are too heinous or too immoral. In fact, in some cases, breaking the law can be morally required. Again, this is generally a consensus view. There are no serious moral theorists who believe that every single law that gets put onto the books is universally binding for everybody under all circumstances. We're going to acknowledge that the law and morality can come apart in this way. And the other thing to point out is that whatever the moral force of the law happens to be, it doesn't exhaust our moral obligations. So even if something is legally, permissible, you aren't breaking any laws with respect to what you're doing, you can still be morally required to do things that aren't legally required. Or you can be morally criticized for doing something that's perfectly legal. So there aren't really any laws, for example, against rudeness. You can't be arrested, for example, for being rude. But there are situations where you can be criticized for being rude or callous or inconsiderate or whatever you want to call it. So, long story short, as we move forward in this class, we're going to encounter situations where there are laws on the books about certain kinds of human enhancement. And we won't ignore those, but we're generally not going to just take it as a sort of end game that, oh, well, this is, it's illegal to use steroids in baseball, therefore it's wrong. No. It is right now illegal, but we still have to ask the question, is that law on the right track? Or is that a law we should change? Right? Should we change the law and or the rules of baseball so that people can take steroids? Right now, it is illegal to have in your, to essentially sell like prescription Adderall to people who don't have a prescription. Should that be illegal? Should that be something that people are not allowed, are actually allowed to do, or should we, maintain that law and try to discourage, college students who have that prescription from doting out pills to their friends who want to get a little boost before the next exam. So we'll see this come up, certain issues, but we're not going to take the law as being the settling factor on any of these upcoming debates. Anyway, that's enough on Martin Luther King Jr. for now. I do want to stress, read this piece. It is if I was going to say, I'm going to pick one piece, one reading for the whole semester for you to read, this would be the one. Because this is the historically most significant piece among anything that we're reading. It's incredibly well written, historically important, and also, given what's going on in the country right now, worth reading even more so now than it would have been, a few years ago. So take your time and do read that whole thing at some point this semester. I'll see you in the next lecture. All right, real quick, I don't normally make corrections to, generally if I just misspeak and it's a small error or something, I don't make any corrections. But I said one thing that might be misleading if you don't have the full context of it, which was about the death penalty in Georgia. So I had mentioned that it got repealed. So if you go and you look that up, you may discover that there are still executions going on in Georgia, and you may be like, oh, my professor lied to me. No. Here's what I was thinking of. It was repealed in 1973, after this case, Furman versus Georgia. And one of the people in the majority opinion, the person I was thinking of, made this statement about the, who was it? I believe it was Potter Stewart who wrote the actual thing. He said, when they were talking about why they ruled the way they did in this case, they said, these death sentences are cruel and unusual, blah, blah, blah. They're basically saying that the convictions that people have that lead to the death penalty just seem random. There doesn't seem to be any clear rationale for why certain people get the death penalty and others don't. He said, my concurring brothers have demonstrated that if any basis can be discerned for the selection of these few who have been sentenced to death, it is the constitutionally impermissible basis of race. We did acknowledge that racial discrimination has not been proved, and then, kind of differs the issue. But it was, so, I mean, this is kind of hedging your bet, but the idea here is, can't strictly prove that racial discrimination is looking on, but a lot of people believe that that's the main rationale for what separates, the convicted rapists who get the death penalty and the ones who don't. And in any event, the arbitrary nature of the death penalty caused them to rule that you had to, if you were going to have the death penalty in any state, you'd have to remove a variety of its sort of arbitrary and discriminatory effects, as they list up here. in the description on the wiki. So you can read the full text of this case if you ever want to look this up. Georgia did start executing people again about 10 years after this, like in 1983. I think they've executed 76 people beforehand. But if you look at the history of the death penalty, it doesn't look good in Georgia or in a lot of other states. It looks like it's had a very clear that essentially if you were historically, if you're a white person who commits a crime against a black person, even a capital crime, it's unlikely you will get the death penalty. But if you are a black person who commits a capital crime against a white person, it is very likely, historically, that you will get the death penalty. And on its face, there just seems to be something wrong with that. So, anyway, digression over. You will not need to know any of this information on the test. I just wanted you to have the full context of what I was talking about midway through that MLK lecture. So, I'll leave it there for now. You can look this up or look up other information about this case on your own time.